Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 28th of October 2015, just after 1 o'clock, and welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we're going to be joined by live video link by Mark Anderson from American Free Press. We've just had a brief chat with Mark, and he tells us that it's a bit grey and rainy in Michigan, very close to Lake Michigan. So the states, some parts of the states, not too good. Isle of Man is looking a bit gloomy. We've got Coventry dull but clearing, and we've got Slechterweer in Nederland. So there we are, not looking too good in Holland either. And as somebody has just remarked, of course, in politics, it's rain and bad weather every day. So we better get into it. Well, we're just going to start off with a reminder that there was a rally in Parliament Square today for Marine Sergeant Alexander Blackman. This was the Royal Marine who was convicted of the murder of a wounded Taliban fighter. He was ultimately sentenced to 8 years in prison. Many people in the military and, of course, in Britain as a whole, desperately unhappy with that decision, which they say was totally politically motivated. And the key bit is that, the good old Ministry of Defence tried to put the frighteners on serving military personnel, saying that, well, you shouldn't turn up at the rally. But it appears that many of them are risking punishment if they turn up at what the government, via the Ministry of Defence, has now branded a political rally. And we just give people a reminder that, of course, one of the most outrageous things about this trial was the judge. Judge Blackett just happens to be one of the trustees for Help the Heroes. So we're going to say this is outrageous. If you look at this man's career, which you can see on the Help for Heroes page, he is a desk jockey. This man has clearly never been near any of the high-risk areas that Sergeant Alexander Blackman has been. And travesty of justice, I think, Mike, outrageous. So if you haven't given support to the Alexander Blackman campaign, perhaps you'd like to visit and do so. Hopefully there can be some change to his continued imprisonment. Well, on the other hand, if you're found guilty of sexual offences against children and young boys in Britain, you can expect a pretty light sentence, particularly if you're connected with the church, and particularly if you're connected to other members of the church who are connected to the royal family. So we've got retired priest here, Vickery House, 69, was convicted at the Old Bailey of 5 counts of indecent assaults on males, one as young as 14. This is going back and was over a period of 16 years. But the interesting thing about this gentleman is he happened to be working with Bishop Ball, who was a man who was sort of let off initially from other sexual offences against young boys in particular, but was able to count on a member of the royal family to write letters of support. And it's interesting, the Western Morning News has actually said that, counting a member of the royal family amongst those who wrote letters of support. Why don't they name the member of the royal family? I believe it's Prince Charles, isn't it?
I believe it is Prince Charles, yeah.
Yeah, so there we are. Go and fight on the battlefield and commit a crime, and you're going to be in prison for a very long time. Go and abuse young, vulnerable children and boys, and you can expect a fairly light sentence. Well, meanwhile, it's taken the Western Morning News to actually point a finger at the BBC for some more of their rather dubious reporting. So the BBC, having conducted an investigation into itself, is saying with confidence that it's improved. That's good, isn't it, Mike?
Excellent.
I like this. And the subject is their rural coverage. And there was a report conducted in 2014 in which the BBC managed to say that they realised it probably wasn't right to rely on just 3 programmes to cover life in the countryside. Country File, OK, Radio 4's Farming Today, and apparently The Archers is considered by the BBC to be, investigative reporting into life in the countryside. So, not surprisingly, Mr. Bonner, the chief executive of the Countryside Alliance, got stuck in, and he said, however, it's difficult for anyone in the countryside to believe that much has really changed when the BBC allows one of its presenters, Chris Packham, to brand farmers and landowners as the Nasty Brigade in its own BBC Wildlife magazine, seemingly with its full support. I think I know what you might say here, Mike.
Well, no, I was going to say, in fairness, Chris Packham brands all of humanity as being the Nasty Brigade, really, and he is one of these people that would prefer to see humanity wiped off the face of the earth and for the planet to be left to the animals.
Right. I did wonder whether you would say that, of course, the BBC Wildlife magazine was connected with the World Wildlife Fund, which, of course, we've shown as being pretty extreme anyway.
Yes.
But who knows? We'll do a little bit of work into that. Well, we've mentioned over several days potential cuts to the police, but before we get back onto that, just have a look at this. A report that the police had to send out 1,900 letters to people warning them that there were threats to their life in place. And the statistics in this article are that Nottinghamshire police sent out 248 of these so-called Osman warning letters, Met Police 207, Kent Police 117, South Wales Police 97. So the police are having to write to people and to say, you turn up at a meeting, you could be dead. But apparently no problem with policing, Mike. Well, maybe there is, because we've now got the real warnings of massive cuts to bobbies on the beat. We've got Sarah Thornton, previously Chief Constable of Thames Valley Police, now part of the National Police Chiefs Council.
Well, in fact, she's head of that.
Head, yes, chairperson, woman. And we've got her Deputy Commissioner we've got a Mr. Mackey, the Deputy Commissioner for the Met. This is what they're saying, that the Met is anticipating up to £1 billion cut in funding, which could lead to 8,000 job losses, which is a quarter of the force going. At the same time, we're seeing reports about the rise of gang warfare and drugs in London. Here's the cuts to the police. And what are they going to do about it? He said the Met is also considering seeking funding from banks and other big businesses to help pay for investigations into certain offences such as cybercrime. Will the banks be paying for police investigations into fraud and corruption in the banks, Mike, or is that a little bit tricky?
There have been so many dangerous precedents set in recent weeks with regard under the banner of austerity, but this has got to be one of the most insane. Mark, what's going on in the United States? Is the US police coming under the same kind of funding pressure as we seem to be seeing in this country?
In the United States, most of the funding is through the Department of Homeland Security, and what they do is they militarize the police with surplus military gear, everything from flashbang grenades to armored personnel carriers to fully automatic weapons, particularly your urban police in your bigger cities. That's in the U.S., that's where the rub is. That's the main influence of federal money on local and state police.
But what about just sort of general day-to-day policing? Are they seeing budgets cut? I mean, what we're seeing in this country, for example, is a massive move towards privatization of police services and security companies. In Plymouth, for example, they've given a contract to a security company to provide policing for the city centre. And so the police service here is completely sidelined by a private company. Is this going on in the States?
Not really. You'll see it in certain limited areas, like providing security for particular buildings or particular institutions, but generally no. Here it's more of a collusion of federal and state police. Now, the Michigan State Police, for example, they do get federal funding for, basic operations, not just special projects, not just militarization and military surplus gear. But you don't see as much privatization in the police itself. Although that could change in terms of private influence of police. There are police agencies here that are trained by Israeli outlets and different private companies and private consultants that train our police and that includes teaching them about hate crimes to regard patriots and liberty-minded people as potential domestic terrorists.
Yeah, yeah. So we seem to be taking the lead on this one, Brian, if we're now going to be getting banks to fund police operations.
Well, this is quite true.
Yeah. So let's look at the economic situation. Now, we had intended to cover this yesterday, but we didn't quite. We ran out of time on this, so this is a day old. But anyway, Andrew Neil was tweeting out, because he's a BBC expert, of course, tweeting out how UK economic growth is 0.5% in the third quarter of 2015. This is following statistics released by the Office for National Statistics. And he's saying that this is down from 0.7% in the second quarter. But that's okay, because it's just the first round of lies. We don't have to, the lies can be amended as time goes on, is what he's saying.
I've just noticed on that, of course, Mike, that it's an estimate.
That's right. That's my point. It's the first round of lies. So what
well,
they're actually doing.
I was going to suggest they got a smart meter in to actually
meter this. Well, this is a good point, because perhaps the ONS would be aggrieved that I'm suggesting that this is lies. But why release an estimate? What they're actually doing is they're getting this inaccurate figure out. This grabs the headlines, and then what can happen is that later on, in a few weeks' time, if the actual number is bigger, they can grab a second lot of headlines. If the actual number is smaller, they can just sort of brush it under the carpet. So anyway, I thought I would have a look and see what's actually driving the massive success of Britain's long-term economic disaster. And it's services. So apparently we're servicing ourselves very well, Brian, and that's what's driving it. So there you go, 0.59% in the services industry. You'll see the construction is down, production about the same, agriculture hasn't changed at all. So we're servicing ourselves very well. Now, of course, David Cameron, very happy with this situation. 12.3% bigger is the size of the economy than the start of when he became Prime Minister. We must stick with our plan to deliver economic security, is what he says. So that's good. So the question is, what is really driving this? And I think this says it all, because, of course, this is it, debt. The point here is that 12.3%, it's a pathetic increase in GDP since 2010. And it's not the result of productivity. It's not the result of earned income. It's the result of more and more funny money. So people would then say, well, if that's the case, why is this not driving inflation? And of course, that's partly because most of it is not appearing in the real economy. There's just enough appearing to make this fake rise that they are promoting. But it's also mainly because of the collapse of commodity prices, because what that represents is a real collapse in productivity. Too much steel, no demand for steel, prices fall, jobs lost. This is the reality of the situation. King David clearly extremely proud of his record, and I'm sure George Osborne is as well. But they don't really have too much to be proud of, because it's a load of hot air.
I wonder whether financial security is actually locked into the security of the banks. They're providing us with security, but the fact that everything will be ultimately controlled by the banks. Is that the hidden meaning?
Possibly.
I don't know. I don't know whether, Mark, you'd like to comment on that at all. The state of the global outstanding debt there.
Well, a lot could be said. I mean, you can go off in a lot of different directions. It's impossible to get out of debt when all money is created as debt. And Mike makes a good point that the money created doesn't go into the household and productive sector. It basically goes into the upper loop in our two-loop economy. And that upper loop is this Niagara of money and extremely generous lines of credit that are available for the corporate players in the corporatocracy that has become our governments. And so you're going to see more and more of this, where you have claimed economic growth, and yet the man on the street doesn't see it. And that's because it's not intended for him. And some of the things I'm covering today kind of tie into that.
Yeah.
Bilderberger, Josef Ackermann moving in Cyprus, and the South American quote-unquote other Bilderberg meeting that recently happened. So some of that ties in when we get to that.
Indeed. Okay. Spies then?
Well, I suppose it comes on to spies, but I think, Mike, there's a bit of a theme coming through to what we're seeing in the mainstream press and the media at the moment, and that is that you are mixing reality with sort of cartoon type analysis. We've got another subject we'll come on to, but here's the Telegraph, which is basically trying to tell us that British spies need our data, and as it says here, we should let them have it. So don't worry about GCHQ or MI5, MI6 security services. We need to let them have our data. Why do we need to let them have our data? Apparently because that will help them fight ISIS and ISIL, because it takes more people now to track down these very naughty people. They're very, very difficult despite all of the spying going on. And so the little secondary message there is it's the council's taxmen and assorted other snoopers who want to play James Bond that we should worry about. So we've got the Telegraph mixing the real world and fiction. James Bond, what are you trying to do? Nudging the public into just laying back and accepting spying. And I thought I'd bring in the journalist here, Fraser Nelson, because he begins with a whole paragraph about James Bond. So we've got an unbelievably serious thing going on, which is the British state spying on its citizens, because we're now apparently all potential domestic terrorists or jihadists or ISIL members. Sheer utter nonsense. And this young reporter is equating it with James Bond.
It is a clever piece of psychology, though, isn't it? Because you drift the message in as almost like it's maybe over the years people have dreamt about being a James Bond-like character. They go and watch the movies and they get drawn into this world, this fictional world of spies and how great it is. And really, he's trying to present this data collection as being related to that sort of emotion that you may have felt.
Yes.
with that.
Draw your mind into the James Bond film,
yes.
And then you can understand what's going on. And we were interested that we had a communication from somebody this morning who's got some experience in this sort of data collection work, and they said that the article was based on my favourite word, utter dross. So there we are. Well done, Telegraph. But cybersecurity is still important.
Yeah, well, we mentioned this yesterday. This is CISA, which is the cybersecurity bill in the United States. That bill, as we mentioned yesterday, was ready for passing Congress. In fact, it did pass Congress. So I wanted to highlight the response from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who are an NGO trying to fight for rights in the digital world, as they say. So that bill passed, and they say CISA passed the Senate today in a 74-21 vote. The bill is fundamentally flawed due to its broad immunity clauses, vague definitions, and aggressive spying authorities. The bill now moves to conference committee despite its inability to address problems that caused recent highly publicized computer data breaches like unencrypted files, poor computer architecture, unupdated servers, and employees or contractors clicking malware links. The conference committee between the House of Representatives and the Senate will determine the bill's final language, but no amount of changes in conference could fix the fact that CISA doesn't address the real cybersecurity problems that cause computer data breaches like Target in the US Office of Personnel Management. The passage of CISA reflects the misunderstanding many lawmakers have about technology and security. Computer security engineers were against it, academics were against it, technology companies, including some of Silicon Valley's biggest, like Twitter and Salesforce, were against it. Civil society organizations were against it, and constituents sent over 1 million faxes opposing CISA to senators. With security breaches like T-Mobile, Target, and OPM becoming the norm, Congress knows it needs to do something about cybersecurity. It chose to do the wrong thing. EFF will continue to fight against the bill by urging the conference committee to incorporate pro-privacy language, and we will never stop fighting for lawmakers to either understand technology or understand when they need to listen to people who do. Now, the key point about this bill is that it is a means by which companies can share early cyber threat indicators, as they describe it, with the Department of Homeland Security. But of course, these cyber threat indicators are undefined. And we also have an immunity clause, which means that corporations who mishandle data can't be prosecuted so long as they're sharing that data with the DHS at the time. So even if, as we said yesterday, even if the TalkTalk event, if that had happened under this legislation, TalkTalk, in fact, would have no obligation to tell its customers that there had been a data breach. so long as they were part of the program to share data with the Department for Homeland Security. And of course, the Department for Homeland Security can then share that data with every other three-letter acronym that is going in the United States, as we mentioned yesterday. But I think, Mark, I like your comment on this, because I think the biggest point about this situation is the fact that all these vested interests, all these pressure groups, Silicon Valley companies, and 1 million faxes from individuals to their congresspeople resulted in a complete, their representatives didn't represent their views at all. They were just ignored. So surely people in America have worked out that their representatives are not worth the air that they breathe.
Yeah, that might not be strong enough, Mike, what you just said, not worth the air they breathe. Yeah, the sad thing about the United States now, the government, is that the federal government especially is completely, as far as I can see, tone deaf to citizen concerns about any issue. They're so insulated by a media that protects the system. They're so distanced from their constituents. In America, basically, we elect our slave masters. We don't simply have them foisted upon us, which would almost be more honorable. As soon as they're elected, they're sent off on their way, and a person electing someone to Congress is the only input usually they have in a congressman's life. And when you see 1 million faxes, maybe some of that was emails, and you still see no response, you see that they're totally insulated by whatever companies might have supported this. And that would be through campaign contributions and lobbying. And then, of course, there could be lots of strong arming from government agencies like the National Security Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency and so on. It's a myriad of things, but the U.S. republic, as it's known, it just doesn't work anymore. A parliamentary system is even preferable to what we have. I mean, I'll just be blunt and very fundamental here. This federal government is basically, and I've reported this in American Free Press, it's a failed state. The United States is basically a failed state. It's a government that doesn't work at all at the federal level. And so this is a manifestation of that. And it is really that blunt. It is really that serious.
Okay, well, that federal government was pretty much responsible for this. We'll move on to war now, because this is more evidence covered by Common Dreams here regarding what the US military knew when they were bombing the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital in Kunduz in Afghanistan. And they're saying that Associated Press had provided new evidence this week that the US military knew that the Doctors Without Borders hospital was an active medical facility before they bombed it. Now, there's a big question about why this happened, Mark, particularly because it seems that Médecins Sans Frontières is being targeted at the moment. This is another bombing of a hospital, this time in Yemen, this time by US allies, Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi causing many atrocities in Yemen at the moment, but surely bombing hospitals has got to be, I mean, the MSF is not wrong in suggesting this is a war crime. These types of activities are war crimes.
No. So what we have then, let me get this straight, is in addition to the Afghanistan hospital, we have a Yemen hospital.
That's
also.
right. This happened yesterday.
That's particularly galling when you consider that there was already fallout and condemnations from the Afghanistan hospital bombing. I'll mention that way back in the early 1960s on Kennedy's watch, and it wasn't necessarily JFK's fault, but the UN troops moved in on the central region in Africa of Katanga in the Belgian Congo, what was the Belgian Congo, and hospitals and doctors were bombed and shot there in a coup that was pro-communist that the UN ended up helping protect directly or indirectly. So U.S. foreign policy bombing hospitals, killing doctors goes back at least to 1961 or so. And a lot of people forget about what happened in the Congo. But fast forward to today, you see more of the same. There were lies that we would get out, the U.S. would get out of Afghanistan in 2014. I attended a Foreign Policy Association meeting where the former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, Ronald Newman, in 2012, got in front of the audience in the CBS News building. I was there and said, listen, no matter what you hear in the press, no matter what you're told, we will not get out of Afghanistan, the U.S. forces, until at least 2016 or longer. And the New York Times has it wrong, he said. The Washington Post has it wrong. And all of this is part and parcel of the complete lies of the U.S. as to when we're going to get out of these countries. All the reports and all the predictions are all rosy. They're misleading. The U.S., he said, may not get out of Afghanistan until 2024, and he said that in 2012.
Well, it's interesting you raise that because Time magazine here pointing out that Ashton has been basically at odds with Obama, at least Obama's public statements with regard to this, because the US now, basically Ashton now admitting that the US will begin direct action on the ground in Iraq and in Syria. And of course, this is something that Obama has always said they would not do. Now, what they're saying is this isn't the regular army. This is going to be special forces activities. And I had a chat to Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire earlier today, and his response was yes, special forces in Iraq likely declared continue with covert ops in Syria. And he said Syria is dangerous for the US if ISIS loses control, because ISIS, al-Nusra and the US are the only reliable partners to the US on the ground. And he said the US has only announced this really to counter Russia's overtures to Baghdad this week, and that Russia is one move ahead of the US every time. And of course, the US is then forced to react. Sorry. So I mean, but nonetheless, they are clearly active in these countries, as you say, and the words that come out of Obama's mouth aren't reflected in reality, are they?
No. Oftentimes they'll act like they're having a debate or an argument, but all it really is kind of a type of political play acting. Hey, you say this, I'll say that, I'll deny it, and they go back and forth to save face or to stir up dust. Did I understand you right, Mike, that Ash Carter said our most reliable allies of the United States in Syria are al-Nusra and ISIS?
No, that's Patrick's assessment of the thing.
Okay, just making sure. Well, ironically, in an ironic twist, that's essentially right, since al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda was, remember, the original culprits of 9/11. That's what gave us all these cybersecurity bills in part. And suddenly Al-Qaeda is a sort of fair weather friend, and they were the culprits of 9/11 that took down the shining city on the hill that is the United States. And then ISIS, we say, is this shadow, mysterious enemy that came right out of the sands of Iraq, when in fact, as we've said, there's growing evidence that they're Mossad and MI6 and CIA funded and supplied. All we'd have to do is cut their supply lines, and no one can tell me with a straight face that the U.S. and Britain do not know where the ISIS supply lines are. To believe that would be utter and total nonsense.
I think we're supplying them, so we should know where they are.
Yeah, right.
But anyway, okay, let's move on to Poland, because Poland's just had an election. They've elected a new government, and this is the party of Kaczynski. Kaczynski is the brother of the Kaczynski that was killed in the air crash on their way into Russia when they were. I do apologise. I've forgotten the name of the location. But anyway, new government in Poland, and this is absolutely a Eurosceptic government. But what's interesting here, and the point of this article, is that the new President Duda, is basically saying that they will not ratify any carbon cutting pact in December, whenever the Paris conference takes place. Now, this new government in Poland is quite interesting because they are rabidly anti-Putin because of the air crash that killed Kaczynski's brother, but they are also rabidly anti-EU as well. But because of the Putin thing, I suspect they will try to keep ties with the United States. So it's going to be interesting how all this lot plays out over the next couple of months. And we'll see whether they actually stick to this plan not to ratify any carbon cutting deal. Because, of course, the other countries in the world that aren't prepared to ratify that are the likes of China and India and Russia.
Yeah. Simple thing we could be saying, Mike, is that people's heads are not on looking after their daily lives and their own countries, their own nationality. Nothing is stable anymore. Is it? People, instead of worrying about matters which concern Poland, we've got climate change, or we've got massive immigration into Europe. Everything is turbulence and chaos, and becoming more so, and which I believe is deliberate.
Global agendas too.
Yeah.
And speaking of this type of thing, we have this situation, the radioactive waste management situation. Now, last night in Plymouth, there was a public consultation on the deep geological disposal of high-level nuclear waste, well, of nuclear waste in general, but including high-level nuclear waste. And apparently this is a plan. Ian Crane was at this event and he gave me a bit of feedback on it this morning. This is a plan to spend billions and billions of pounds to build what's basically a 10 square mile cavern, 3,000 feet below the surface of the earth, in which they will dump all the nuclear waste which is dotted around in various research facilities and near nuclear reactors in the country. Now, Scotland, as Ian pointed out, has decided they're not going to do this. They're going to wait for technology to arrive, which can be used to deal with the waste. But that, I think, is pretty much equally as insane as the idea of digging this great big hole in the ground, because they aren't actually promoting the research which would bring that technology about. They're just going to wait. But in any case, on Monday, Ian said he wasn't planning on doing a fracking nightmare this week. But as a result of this event that he was at last night, he is going to do a special edition of Fracking Nightmare, which will go out at 9 p.m. on Monday. So please join us for that, because it was clear from the meeting that the people that are promoting this idea don't actually have a clue how they're going to do it. They're really relying on somebody coming along and volunteering that their community should be the location for this. It's pretty incredible. I
don't know whether it's fair to say this, but I don't remember seeing any big adverts in local press or media about that meeting.
This was one of Ian's points. There was no publicity for this whatsoever. So the only people that were at it were academics, because one of the people promoting this is the sustainability guru from Plymouth University, whose name escapes me at the moment. And there were a lot of students there. But really it wasn't so much a public event, because it wasn't promoted publicly. Now, I think there are only 3 of these events left. This has been a consultation which has gone right around the country. There are 3 of these events left, one in Belfast, I think, and a couple of others. And if you have a look at Ian Crane's Facebook page, you'll find the details of those. But do join us on Monday for that. And I'll just remind you again of Mike Mitchum's event, which is taking place next Sunday, this coming Sunday, just north of Brighton. Do come along to that if you're able to get to it. Details at the Get Wired website. So if you type Get Wired into your respective search engine, you will find that. Okay, what's next?
Right, well, we were going to move on to effectively constitutional issues, devolution. But I'm going to say a big thank you to the person who brought this to my attention. It's a tweet from John Mann MP, who is saying that he secured a 30-minute debate on the One List review and the Dickens file in Parliament Wednesday, the 4th of November. So we're going to say well done. Okay, this looks as though at least there's going to be some sort of debate about child abuse in Parliament. I predict that the numbers will be pitifully low. We've seen this before when the subject of the abuse of children comes up. There's maybe 10 or 12 people in the House, so that will be interesting to see. But what also caught our attention was this tweet, which went with it. My campaign to abolish the unelected House of Lords appears to have some surprising new supporters. So we've all of a sudden we've got John Mann jumping into let's destroy the constitution of this country. Get rid of the Lords as if it's a sort of, well, they're a bit of a nuisance. They're nothing to do with the governance of the country. We'll just scrap them. Is this man badly informed, Mike, or do you think there's some malevolence in what he's trying to do here?
I think you can't, just because he's campaigning usefully in one subject, you can't rely on people to campaign usefully on all subjects. And, you know, what more can we say? At the end of the day, the House of Lords demonstrated this week that they have a purpose when they choose to put their mind to it.
Which is why
he's got some new supporters, yes.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, the devolution issue keeps running on, and it seems that some people aren't so happy with it because this situation in Yorkshire has been coming to a head over the last few weeks and months. Because, of course, Yorkshire, part of the so-called Northern Powerhouse, they are attempting to set up devolved cities in Yorkshire, but it's on the basis of what they're calling Greater Yorkshire, which seems to be pretty much like a European region, and this seems to be causing problems. Now, it's all part of the core cities agenda, the move to create a 21st century feudalist city-states. And of course, at the heart of these city-states is a smart grid, which we were covering yesterday with Mike Mitchum. But as I say, people are fighting over this, and this is mainly because the government is trying to make a condition of devolution the imposition of elected mayors. So they've got to accept that they will have elected mayors as to head up their cities, or they don't get the devolved powers. Now, there was some speculation that during the debate on this, an amendment had been agreed which would remove the requirement for elected mayors, but in fact that doesn't seem to be the case. It's been confirmed by the government that they are going to ignore any such amendment, and they're going to press ahead with this. The man in the photograph there is Jeremy Corbyn's shadow community secretary, John Trickett, who's basically said, you can't impose mayors as a condition for devolution. We will insist there should be no top-down imposition. You can have a democracy by imposing. Sorry, you can't have a democracy by imposing a particular form of governance. It's what you would imagine from a dictatorship, not a democracy. If people don't want them, why should they have them? And that's really what the argument is about. And other people saying, you know, there's no such thing as Greater Yorkshire. It's an artificial construct. Now, I can't remember exactly who said that, but of course, the question is, are they being utterly naive? Because it's a United Nations or EU construct, depending on which level you decide to look at, because that's how they are splitting up these regions. So it's going to be interesting to watch how this situation develops. The question is, will there be any real opposition to this, or is it just posturing?
Hopefully there's going to be real opposition, Mike, and that will come about if people are aware of what's going on. In the chat box, of course, it's been pointed out quite rightly that the regionalisation of Britain and Europe and indeed America is coming about as the result of UN policy, and that takes us to the one world government system.
And of course, part and parcel of that one world governance system is the three free trade agreements, of which TTIP is a part. You wanted me to highlight this article from TechDirt, Mark, because they're suggesting that they're breaking promises on the environment. Now, I have to say, as I was reading down through this, it seemed to be environmental groups almost implying that TTIP was no good because it was breaking promises on the environment, whereas if they weren't breaking promises on the environment, perhaps TTIP would be a good thing. Is that how you're reading the situation? Is this just a faction fight within groups that are generally in support of this agreement?
Not necessarily. There could be some factional things in there. I think what's important here is that you have even more proof that the investor-state dispute settlement courts, these private tribunals, these private courts that would be set up under the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the TAFTA-TTIP agreement, which is the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement linked in with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, that this is private government, and that this is more proof of that. You have a lot of environmental related legislation, and in these investor investor-state dispute settlements in cases that have been brought against 20 EU member states for the last 21 years. These courts already exist to a point. 60% do concern environmental related legislation. Now, remember, that could include fracking. And so if a country wanted to ban fracking or minimize it under these pending trade agreements, these private courts might be used to override local or national laws against fracking. So I think even though this may be factional, I think there's a lot of value here to read about what's going on. And it mentions here that the central problem of the TAFTA TTIP agreement that's a little bit behind schedule is that corporate sovereignty is inherent in these private courts. And that, in other words, companies are allowed to place the preservation of their profits above any other consideration, including the environment, but also health, GMO foods, basic safety, various social goals. And so it really transcends just the environment, and it just brings home the fact that these trade and investment deals are not just about trade, and they're not just about investments, but they're about private government, a literal redrawing of the lines as to what government even means. And this is just more proof of that. Of course, a little bit of good news apparently is that TTIP is behind schedule. The one that's in the front of the line right now is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That one is moving much faster. So that's the key points to make here for now, although there are factions and perhaps misrepresentations going on.
Okay, well, let's move on then. What is a Bilderberger doing running a bank in Cyprus?
Well, that's a good question.
Has he really had a crisis of conscience?
Well, you would like to think so. And I won't deny any man or woman on this earth, of course, the opportunity to have a crisis of conscience. But I'm afraid if Mr. Josef Ackermann had a wrestling match with his conscience, I'm afraid that he might win and his conscience might lose. At any rate, this former Deutsche Bank chief, excuse me, I'm fiddling with my computer. Oh boy, this thing. At any rate, he's moving into Cyprus, saying that he's drawing a limited salary of 68,000 or so euro a year. And I'm having a little malfunction. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we're fine.
Okay. I'm trying to zero in on something. Excuse me a second here.
Right. So basically, he's saying that he feels the need to redeem himself because of what happened in the Cypriot banking crisis, and therefore he's joined the central bank or the central bank in Cyprus in order to try to undo some of the wrongs that he did at the time.
Right.
Does he have? I mean, he doesn't have any conscience, does he? He doesn't feel any guilt.
Well, I don't know that it matters in the sense of what banks do. Now, you made a good point, if I understood you right, Mike. Even the New York Times, as sympathetic as they are to the banking chiefs that basically run the world, even the New York Times said, quote, the Swiss banker Josef Ackermann played a role in the events that nearly destroyed the Cyprus banking system just 2 years ago in 2013. Now he's back in this sleepy capital, it says, toiling, laboring to fix one of the very banks he helped undermine. And that's not even attributed. That's a straight statement from the normally banker-friendly New York Times saying this. So whether a banker has a flicker of conscience or not belies the point that the way banking works is such a commandeering thing on a sovereign nation that even the best intended, even the most well-intended banker is really a threat to life and limb. The way money comes into existence, what happens when a bank makes a loan? They basically just monetize the note. You go in and you sign a note for a loan. The bank doesn't loan you its own money, and it doesn't loan you its depositors' money. It simply enters money into the ledger and creates a demand deposit account out of thin air and attaches interest to it based on your signature. Your signature on the note is the same as if you deposited the money that you're about to borrow. So the borrower basically creates the money through signing a note. This is the way it works through much of the commercial banking system under the Federal Reserve within the United States. So even the most well-intended banker has basically expropriated the community wealth, the public credit, if you will, and they turn people's economic power against them. And so, you know, Joseph Ackermann is another player in this large scheme that we call banking. So his personal conscience, however troubled it may be, really is beside the point when you consider how fundamentally dishonest banking really is.
Yeah.
And so, it's just a matter of style. What his personal style maybe now might be a little bit more agreeable with the public, but now he's got an office in Nicosia, I think it's pronounced, and it's not as grand as his Deutsche Bank office. And of course, Joseph Ackermann, as we mentioned, has been a frequent Bilderberg attendee. And this doesn't necessarily mean his Bilderberg membership is central to this story, but oftentimes you see top Bilderberg attendees like Draghi and Mario Monti and Jean-Claude Trichet and people like Joseph Ackermann, always in key positions. And they're all Bilderberg and Trilateral members, and they always seem to rise to the top and have the most commandeering positions. And so, Mr. Ackermann will do what bankers do. And no matter how honest he is or how much his conscience has been riddled with guilt, the system he uses and the system he abides by is fundamentally dishonest.
Yeah. And speaking of dishonest systems, this is what a sideshow to the Bilderberg Group, or a similar type of organization meeting in Peru?
Yes, I'm moving on to that. And looking at that, I was given this by an American Free Press colleague, and I haven't had time to read up on it a whole lot, but there was just an annual meeting of the Board of Governors of the International Monetary Fund in Peru, of all places, and it's made up of central bankers and finance ministers from the IMF's 188 member nations, but the governors, according to what I understand, are given direction, some may say marching orders, from the 24-member International Monetary and Financial Committee. And the IMFC, as it's known, included in its participation Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, and who's also chairman of the Financial Stability Board, and a bunch of other bankers and finance ministers. And what's notable here is during these recent Peru meetings of these IMF entities, there were a lot of side meetings where the press was not invited and where a lot of deal making goes on. So you have a kind of Bilderberg 2, if you will, a kind of virtual shadow Bilderberg developing here. Mario Draghi was there. I believe I mentioned his name a minute ago. And it involves G7 and G20 countries. But what's also interesting is that playing an auxiliary role is a little-known United States entity called the Group of 30. And that's a private club of bankers in Washington, D.C., again, called the Group of 30. And they're having kind of a auxiliary role in this big banking powwow that included, as I said, all these side meetings, all these breakout sessions that were completely closed to the press. The only things open to the press, as I understand it, were the main official meetings where they did give basic press conferences. Now, that's more open than Bilderberg, of course, but these side meetings were completely closed off. And the speculation, and probably a little bit more than speculation, is that these side meetings are where the real deal making takes place. And that also involved was the Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank of the central banks based in Basel, Switzerland. So this deserves at least a closer look, and that's what I'm going to be looking at for American Free Press here in the very near future.
Okay, Mark, brilliant. So let's move on to this then. Planned Parenthood, what is going? Is this eugenics in operation? Is this what you're suggesting in this American Free Press article?
Yeah, pardon me a second. In essence, yes. As I've mentioned on this show before, the abortion issue is often misunderstood, and somehow people compartmentalize it and see it in some people's eyes as a fundamental freedom of women and others as a non-issue. But what I contend is that abortion is tyranny in action. It's just simply clothed and camouflaged in a kind of hardship, humanitarian garb where we overlook the reality of what's going on. Every time an abortion happens, somebody dies. We have to keep that in mind. No matter what you may want to think about it, it's an undeniable fact. But when you look at the issue of the Negro Project that you showed on that posting, if you go back to the early 20th century, an activist named Margaret Sanger, who founded these organizations that led to Planned Parenthood, she explicitly stated that she wanted to rid the United States of undesirables, of minorities. Now, that's some pretty blunt language, and it's amazing how tone deaf abortion advocates are to their hero, Margaret Sanger, their founder, when she would speak in terms of eugenics, when she would speak of weeding out undesirables, who she literally called human weeds. Now, the human weeds could be anybody depending on the political expediencies of the moment. It could be blacks today, Hispanics tomorrow, and whites the next day. And we know this from the hard political realities of power politics. And you fast forward to today, and you have Planned Parenthood selling body parts and tissue from fetuses, and you have a prosecutable, actionable crime that you would think would result in police raids of Planned Parenthood facilities, but that's not happening.
Yeah.
Instead, we're watching glacial legislation to try and be passed that would defund Planned Parenthood. But the bottom line is we need to keep this issue on our radar, not just as some confusing social issue where Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court decision in the United States, is the ruling idea, but rather that this is tyranny in action, that this is, actual a type of genocide, if you will, a infanticide, democide, homicide, whatever you might want to call it. But, this isn't some future dystopia. This is now.
Yes. Okay. Sorry.
I'll just add to that Mark, I've been hearing. I haven't got the figures. I haven't got the evidence in front of me, but I've been hearing that it's apparently noticeable that there's been a significant drop in the birth rate of Down syndrome children here in UK, and the inference is that these children are being quietly disposed of before birth. We've obviously seen all this Planned Parenthood thing before, of course, very, very big in the 1930s in particular, and many people involved at high level in British and American politics were immensely involved in it. So we tend to, mainstream media tends to skew the issue across this was something those nasty Nazis did. But if we look at the origins of this, it's absolutely embedded in UK and US establishment figures.
Oh, absolutely. And, it's just important, as I say, that we keep this issue out there. We don't forget about it. And we look at the reality of what's going on. I'll just mention that there's something known. It goes back to, I believe, St. Thomas Aquinas. If my history's right, forgive me if it's wrong, unless it's St. Augustine. But the law of double effect. In other words, there's the argument that what about the life of the mother? Well, as Charles Rice, the noted professor emeritus of law at Notre Dame, once explained to me in long interviews that I had with him, the law of double effect is where the doctor tries to save both the life of the mother and the preborn child. There's never an intention to kill either one or to let either one die. It's all a matter of intent, Dr. Rice would repeatedly tell me. Abortion is the direct and intentional killing of the fetus. If the doctor tries to save both, that's the proper ethical standard. You don't intentionally try and kill or allow to die either one. So this argument of the life of the mother is rather specious. You don't necessarily have to sacrifice one for the other.
Right. Well, we're going to end by coming back onto to what we see as the press gently manipulating people's minds. And we've chosen this story in the Daily Mail that the police have launched a YouTube advertising campaign comparing giving sexual consent to making a cup of tea. I'm going to encourage all of our viewers and indeed listeners to go and have a look at this because it is so incredible. So the whole thing revolves around a Stickman cartoon video with a very condescending voiceover, which is basically saying you don't give somebody a cup of tea and force them to drink it. They have to want it, and say that they actually want that cup of tea. So this is cartoon animation, which is supposedly teaching people the difference between a woman giving consent to sex and a woman not giving her consent to sex. And we adults have now become so stupid and dumb that we need a cartoon film to understand this. Perhaps I could also rather darkly and cynically say, of course, is a would-be rapist going to take the slightest notice of a stick cartoon that's been pushed out? Now, what we're fascinated about is the drive for this has come out of Thames Valley Police and indeed the Met Police. And let's remember, it was Sarah Thornton, so that's the lady in uniform on the right of that there UK column front page, who at the time was the boss of Thames Valley Police, did absolutely nothing to protect both girls and boys being seriously sexually harassed, physically harassed and abused at Oxford and Cherwell Valley College. So sheer hypocrisy and double standards. But let's have a look into what's really going on behind this article. Here's Get Bucks reporting it. Thames Valley Police launch Consent is Everything campaign. I did notice the gun strapped on there as well, but we'll leave that for the moment. So this is what it is, a campaign shining a light on sexual consent and the responsibility to get consent rather than assume it's been given. That's a very interesting expression there. So who's involved in it? Well, it's this lot. It's Rape Crisis, Wickham, Oxfordshire Sexual Abuse and Rape Crisis Centre, Thames Valley Police and Oxford University Students' Union. And together they all form what they are calling the Thames Valley Sexual Violence Prevention Group. When I tried to call some of these people this morning, you got answer phone. So if you were in a bit of a state, you'd been raped, you weren't going to get an instant response. We called the police asking for more details. Their media team didn't come back to us. But Detective Chief Inspector Justin Fletcher of Thames Valley Police said, victims can have confidence in reporting to police. We will listen and they will be believed. To which our question is, but the police won't actually take any notice, because that was what was happening with the young girl victims of the paedophiles and indeed the victims at Thames Valley Police. So this is the sort of thing that this video had. It said that consent is simple as drinking tea. Had to show us a cup of tea in case we weren't sure what that was. And then, of course, if the lady in this was not too sure whether she wanted a cup of tea, you shouldn't serve her with a cup of tea, and you definitely shouldn't try and force the cup of tea on a person who doesn't want it. So although part of this is aimed at freshers, in particular at Oxford University, because they seem to have a particular problem with unwanted sexual advances, it would appear, we need to be given a cartoon so that we can understand it. Well, where would this cartoon come from? Well, the article in the paper mentioned rock star dinosaur pirate princess as being responsible and a source of the video. So we went to have a look at that. And here's a lady talking about when she was 5 years old. She's giving a list of her wants and needs at 5 years old, and a little dinosaur. Not quite sure what the significance of that is. And then we got on to more interesting things, because we got onto Facebook pages, and all of a sudden the language changes dramatically. So we're now into a sexual orientation to what this cup of tea is about. And just because the Facebook header didn't show it all, I took that image out so you can see exactly what this woman is talking about. So this is apparently one of the people now advising Thames Valley Police on how you deal with the issue of rape. Please check all this out yourself. When you get onto the Dinosaur Princess's page, you will see it says something interesting here. It says, because this is all part of the Crown Prosecution Service's Consent Is campaign. So this will be the same Crown Prosecution Service that couldn't protect Melanie Shaw, that couldn't take a prosecution forward on Holly Gregg, children who certainly didn't give their consent, but now they are dealing with a foul-mouthed woman who is boasting of her prowess on Facebook. And here's the studio that produced the animation, apparently Blue Seat Studios, based in Rhode Island, USA, charging a mere $2,500 a day. So I don't know how much their animation took to teach us what consent is all about. And if we follow it through, here's the Crown Prosecution Service. So it's definitely there. Where does that lead us? Well, we're back to the video and a whole list of people who are apparently protecting people from unwanted sexual advances, except, of course, if you are a child, and there's not one word about the rape of children. I believe, Mike, that this is a desperately cynical media ploy to take people's minds away from the rape and abuse of children, and you're skewing it sideways, still on a serious issue, the rape of adults, but you're now mixing it with cartoon. This is messing around with people's heads.
Yeah.
Mark, I'll give you just a quick word on that, quick reply. Are we going mad, or are we seeing something here? This is madness, is it not?
Well, certainly these kind of advice for consent and things like that have traditionally been the role of parents when families were stronger. The state and their media allies kind of expropriate that function, and that they try and preach to us this new gospel of sexual liberation, if you will, or moral ambiguity, where there are no rights and wrongs, there are no ethical principles worth defending. And it very well could be a diversionary tactic as well, to kind of cloud the issue so you don't pay attention to homosexual rape of children.
Yeah. Okay, well, Mark, thank you very much for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. We will, of course. And before we go, I know we've just run on past the hour. I would like to say that we see some very interesting emails coming into the UK column, many of them very complimentary, which is nice, some of them positively critical. But we did have to mention one today because it's so outstanding. It says the trouble with the UK column is that they could do so much more. And that comment came at the end of an email from a man who, it seems to us, spends his whole day sending emails. But quite remarkable. We'd like to say thank you very much for that. We could do so much more. Of course we could. And on that note, with your support, if you haven't subscribed or donated to the UK column, perhaps you'd like to do that. And anybody who's got written material, anybody who has got detailed and evidence-based information about what's happening with the country, in the country, we'd like to take that. We certainly would like to do so much more, but sometimes there just doesn't seem to be enough hours in the day. We'll leave you with that thought. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.